Hi, welcome to this week's SOCA1010 lecture where I'll be talking about consumption. I'm going to break this week's content up into 4 videos. The first is going to be just an overview of some key terms and to talk about what consumption is and why it's important. The next 2 will be broken up into different sociological concepts to think about consumption. And the last section will be a little bit more about the various politics of consumption, particularly around what happened in the late 90s and early 2000s around what was called anti-globalization movements and the new politics of consumption. So in this first section, it's going to be quite short in terms of what I talk about, because most of the time I want you to spend is watching that first video there, the story of stuff. That goes for about 20 minutes. And I've got a page of links there to some other videos that will be very useful for you to have a look at for the other conceptual stuff in the course. Some of which I'll get you to look at specifically, and others are there just to kind of for your own interest. So yeah, please stop this video now and have a look at the story of stuff. Okay, so hopefully you've watched that video and you've got a bit more of an idea of what I'm going to be talking about this week. Well, that video is really good in the sense that it's quite simply shows the connections between things in terms of production and consumption processes, but also in terms of the way that we live, that kind of work, consume, sleep kind of thing that she talks about in that. What's also important in that, I think, is in terms of what it means in terms of responsibility. So I'm going to talk a lot about consumer politics today, but really, as that video points out, as much of the waste and much of the pollution happens at the production end. So this has engendered a lot of debates within the social sciences about, can capitalism as a system adjust itself radically enough to become sustainable and to kind of, I suppose, stop that mental and environmental destruction. If it changes so much, could we go and call it capitalism, and maybe then, in terms of Marx's idea of the way that history progresses, that we'll need to move on to another mode of production. So in some ways, that's the kind of process that I'm talking about today. In the previous week, we looked at Marx's idea of how class societies develop from the shift from feudalism to capitalism. Throughout the 20th century, many theorists that were influenced by Marx, that kind of wanted that shift to socialism or communism to happen, started to wonder why it wasn't, even though things would be getting more and more alienated and more exploitative. And they started to think about what's termed as ideology as a way of explaining why people aren't forming a revolution. And the theorists I'll be looking at today looked at the idea of consumption as a way of kind of sedating the masses in particular, sedating them from kind of knowing what their true needs are in terms of this kind of Marxist theory, and keeping them distracted and in their place. So on the screen there's a couple of key terms. Materialism, which is thinking about the way that accumulating material goods at the expense of everything else is kind of seen as being successful in society. Consumerism is then the kind of systems, the critical thought towards that, thinking about how consumerism kind of replaces class loyalties. People become loyal to brands and lifestyles, and even though often that tends to correlate with class, people then kind of associate with people like themselves, and this kind of has a kind of detrimental effect on the possibility of class consciousness development. So Marxists argue basically this consumer self, this commodified self that people become, allows people to feel like they have a freedom to express themselves, but really they're just expressing ideology. In relation to this is the notion of hedonism that kind of correlates to ideas of instant gratification, and this is the kind of constant pursuit of pleasure in life. And again, these critical theorists tend to engage critically with this idea because they argue this kind of distracts us from our true needs and depoliticizes us and makes art less important and this kind of thing. The commodified self and hedonistic practices are done through what's often referred to in Marxian thought as commodity fetishism, that I'll get into a little bit more later on in the lecture. I'll get into that now. So this occurs when a person has harmful obsessions with collecting consumer objects. This, kind of idea that's, present in even some pop culture movies about one's possessions start to enslave them. You can see this, movies like Fight Club and stuff like that are about that kind of thing, or at least aspects of that. So you can see this in all kinds of aspects, the way that we kind of give consumer things almost humanistic qualities. People name their cars, and people get obsessed with collecting things, or having the latest iPhone or whatever. But there's a whole kind of different examples I'm sure you could think of in your day-to-day life where we fetishize products. Hipster culture, as I've spoken about a little bit, is kind of a really good example of this. The kind of fetishizing of organically made beers with some kind of flavour, or coffee with beans from some regional centre in some country overseas that makes it more authentic or something. So as I said last week in the week on class, and particularly talking about Marx and Weber, we looked at the relations of production and the way that kind of Marx focused on that, and then Weber started to think a little bit more about status that kind of brings in the notion of consumption, and then we looked at Bourdieu to kind of think in that more deeply, I suppose. So this kind of shift is reflective of what's sometimes referred to as the cultural turn in the social sciences. In the post-World War period, World War II period, in the 50s in particular, where people started to have more disposable income, consumer culture started to be something that sociologists were really, really interested in. The argument here is that some people argue we've moved from production society to a consumption society. Some people argue that our identity is now more bound within our consumption practices than our production practices. We're more likely to think of ourselves and others, about them through and with their music tastes or what they wear, rather than if they're, say, a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, or a tradesperson or whatever. But really, the sensible position is it's still a bit of both. It's no good kind of jettisoning production and focusing on consumption, or vice versa, because they're obviously part of the same system, and both of these things still are really important in terms of the way that societies function, the way that groups and collectives identify with each other or not, and the way that as individuals we think of ourselves and our own place in the world. So Marx wasn't that interested in consumption practices per se, but he was interested in commodities. And I suppose the production process, capitalism, in the way that Marx theorised it, and particularly the way it was theorised throughout the 20th century, whereas, capitalism produces commodities. And within this process, the workers themselves will be alienated and estranged for that product. And so, as I've spoken about before, this is the idea that if, as a worker, you were, making a table or something, the craftsman, pre-capitalism would, get a tree, and then cut all the wood up, shape it all, connect it all, make that table from scratch. As capitalism becomes the way that things are produced, these things become done in things like factories, that kind of Model T Ford way of producing things, where people just become an appendage of that factory machine. For Marx and many theorists influenced by Marx, this would result in alienation and estrangement. But I suppose what's interesting about this is that there's much then debate about why our levels of alienation, estrangement, and exploitation haven't resulted in a revolution. And this is the result of what's called ideology from Marxist theorists, where, particularly originally things like religion, and then increasingly the media, and then consumption, and, people would talk about the way that our social media and iPhones today encourage us to kind of practice our lives in particular ways, and concentrate on particular things, rather than, say, our own true species being. So I think a nice way to illustrate this is in the snippet there from YouTube from a movie about Slavoj Žižek, who's a very prominent social scientist and theorist. And what Žižek does is use the kind of, I think, mid-80s B movie called They Live, which is about capitalist ideology and the kind of way of thinking about how ideology works. So again, I'd like you to pause it there and have a quick look at that little snippet of the video. So just to conclude on that, as the video points out, ideology is this kind of way of seeing the world, where we're kind of inculcated from an early age through socialization processes to think about the world in a particular way, and not think critically too much about it. Marxists tend to argue that people are like the masses. They are pseudo-individualistic, that I'll get into in a minute. But what I think is interesting about what that video says, and Zizek has been quite important in this way of thinking, is that even when you think you're not within ideology and you're being critical of it, Zizek argues that's often the most powerful time that you are being influenced by ideology. And what him and other theorists mean by that is that in recent decades, people are increasingly kind of cynical and ironic and reflexive about the world, and kind of sometimes critically relate to it, and roll their eyes and kind of make ironic memes or whatever and that kind of stuff. But in the end, they're not really doing much to change things. So you can be kind of critical of the system, but still then kind of reproduce it in your own actions, even if those actions are by not doing anything to change stuff. So ideology here becomes about the way that different powerful institutions of society, that education system stuff, like the Pink Floyd song, Another Brick in the Wall, religion in particular, Marx theorizes the opium of the masses. Increasingly, in our current decades, things like the media and consumption practices are ways of living and ways of accessing information and ways of practicing your life that, according to this Marxist point of view, just reproduced capitalism and capitalist relations over and over again.